Nas Daily is a YouTube channel that puts out topics on issues that face the modern world and how we can maybe address them. And they recently put out a video on having kids and the environmental impact of that. And I wanted to react to that today and give some of my thoughts on the framing and the stuff they say in it, because I didn't think it was the most helpful way of talking about the subject. And I think the subject is maybe something actually that we should steer away from talking about procreation. So let's get into it.
Okay. Yesterday, I was discussing having kids with my girlfriend, Aline. Then, all of a sudden, our roommate, Lorena, showed out of nowhere and said this.
People say kids are bad for the environment.
Kids are bad for the environment? Another thing? Is this true?
Let me research.
So one thing I want to say straight off the bat is that this framing of kids being bad for the environment, I think, just causes unnecessary friction on this topic, because it focuses on kids, and kids are obviously very innocent. They're probably the group of humans that are the most innocent in terms of, they don't really have moral agency to be able to do things. So when it's framed as in they're bad or they're doing something bad, I think there's more of like a visceral like rejection of that, because we see these innocent individuals and it's like framing them as bad or negative is seen as like more harsh than doing it to a fully grown adult who's fully competent and can make their own decisions and all of this sort of stuff. So I think that's an unhelpful place to start with straight off the bat, is framing it as in kids are bad for the environment. It's not children specifically. It's, if you want to make the claim that humans are bad for the environment, however you define the environment, it's the fact of adding new people. It's not the fact that they're kids. Like, it's understandable that people talk about kids, because obviously we all start out as kids, and so when you do the action of creating someone, you are creating them as a kid. So that's where the confusion comes in, or that's where the focus on kids come in. But I think, like, to reduce friction on this topic, we need to zoom out a bit and just say, like, creating new people. If you want to go down the environmental route, it's creating new people that is bad for the environment.
People say more kids means more pollution. But then, should we stop having kids?
We're 7 billion already.
Think about the planet.
The best thing you can do for the environment is to stop having kids.
Another comment I want to make here on framing is that when people talk about the environment, it's always done in this really like vague way of like the planet or the environment. And obviously we know what the planet is, it's Earth, but what is the environment? Why do we care about the environment? And I think generally in like the environmental movement, but also in this video, they're not focusing on what matters. Like when we say the environment matters, what do we mean? Do we mean like the air or a river or something like that? Like, for me, it's about the actual conscious beings in that environment who are going to be impacted by your actions. And it's not framed that way here. And I think, again, that's not helpful, and it doesn't lead to like clear thinking on this topic, because when you just say the environment, it's this sort of like nebulous thing. But if you pin it down to the actual conscious beings in the environment, like wild animals or people, because the impact that we have on the environment is going to come back and impact us as well.
We're now 7 billion humans, and we'll be 8, 9, 10. That's a lot! But you'll be surprised, because it turns out the real reason we're so many is not because we're having too many kids, but because we stopped dying as much.
Yeah, it's true. Like the increase in population that the world is seeing is not just a function of creating new people. It's also the fact that, I don't know how you would want to call it, like there's a backlog. I mean, in history, it's been that we die quite quickly. So, you die and someone comes to replace you. That's why population, or one of the reasons why population grew so slowly over the past, thousands of years. But recently, because we've been able to live longer, it means that as we live longer, more people are being created, but we're not dying. So they're not replacing us. They're adding to the population. Obviously, we die eventually, but the rate of people being created compared to the rate of people dying is become more skewed. And I actually think this is one of the reasons why it's, I don't know if I'd use the word dangerous, but maybe not the best to frame the topic of procreation in terms of environmental terms, which I know with Nas Daily, they talk a lot about the environment, so they're sort of fitting procreation into the environment rather than fitting environment into procreation. But yeah, I think it's better, at least for anyone who's like critical of procreation, to I don't know if I want to say steer away from the environment, but maybe just like not have it as your main point, is because there are a lot of things that are sustainable that aren't necessarily good, right? So if someone came to you and said, you know, we need to we need to reduce the population or control the population because of environmental reasons, as they were just saying in this Nas Daily video, you know, that's not just a function of procreation, it's also a function of people living longer. So if you want to go down the environmental route, you could come up against the pushback of, well, someone saying, okay, well, if we should be concerned about the environment, do you agree that we shouldn't be extending people's lives as well? Because obviously that does have an impact on the environment. As people live longer, they impact the environment more, which is also contributing to population growth as procreation is. And then it gets into dodgy territory. So I just think like it's better to just not frame your discussion in terms of the environment. You can have environmental discussions like 100%, but framing like procreation in terms of the environment, I just think it's a bit of a slippery slope, and it's better avoided probably.
Let me explain and then get to the solutions. Imagine you always get extra fries because you know your friend will steal some.
Yummy.
And then one day they get high cholesterol and stop taking your fries. And now you have too many fries. This is people, okay? Oh no! People had more kids because some wouldn't live long. But then we got education, vaccines, medicine, and kids survived. So now they didn't need to have extra kids. And then families went from having 5 kids to 2. But even with fewer kids, we are still growing because even the grown-ups are living longer. And yes, we will keep growing and growing, but not forever. We'll stop at 11 billion.
If we're becoming even more, should we have 0 kids instead of 2?
If we did, in the future we'd end up with a lot of old people and very few young people who can work. That's a bit of a people, as in a collapsing.
So she makes the point here about how if we don't have kids, then we'll eventually get to a point where we have like an aging population. There's a lot of old people. They need more support than someone who's in the prime of their life would need. And so you're eventually going to get to a state where society is basically going to collapse, or a pickle is going to collapse, right? And this is true, but there are a few things to say about this. I mean, the first thing to say is that because she's basically implying societal collapse, extinction, this sort of stuff. No matter what happens, humans at some point are going to go extinct. Even if it's as far in the future as just the heat death of the universe, humans at some point will go extinct, whether it's something else that causes it or we cause it to ourselves. So this is something that needs to be factored in. Extinction is going to happen at some point, but are we going to make it so that we get even more complicated as a society, even bigger, and then we have to face it? Or maybe it's something that we should be preparing for, earlier on. Is it something that we want to facilitate ourselves, or is it something that we just want to wait for something to come along and do it for us, which could be, that could lead to a lot of pain and harm to people? These are all questions we need to ask ourselves as a society, and we need to start a conversation around. There's no easy answer to it. This topic is not easy to talk about with people. It can be very emotional for people as well. But even practically speaking, whatever happens, it's going to be a very difficult situation to deal with. The other question I think we should be asking ourselves is, how do we want to view people? Because the framing in this video is that we should be viewing people as a means of solving our own problems. Essentially, we're using people as a means to our own ends. Do we want to be viewing new people as simply ways to solve our own problems, or do we want to try and tackle the problems ourselves and not put that burden on someone else, not kick the can down the road? So I think there's not easy answers to any of these. These are very hard ethical problems, but these are questions that we need to be asking ourselves. And I know this is a short video, and Nas Daily makes punchy videos, so they're not going to ask every question in the world. But these are just very obvious, basic questions that I think need to be asked, and they are just skirting over them in this video.
All good, we're getting to the solutions. It turns out the problem is not the kids, but the habits we have. You see, from the 7 billion people in the world, the middle and upper class make only 3 billion, and yet they're responsible for 85% of pollution, which means the rest of the world, which is 4 billion people, are only responsible for 25%. This shows us that someone who is rich and someone who is poor pollute very differently. So what we realize is that the problem is not the amount of people we are, but the habits we have. And what we can do is to try to be as environmentally friendly as we can. I'll use public transport instead of a car. I won't eat meat, and I'll buy secondhand clothes.
And again, just a quick one, because we've already touched on this, but again, this is another reason why the environmental framing around procreation is, I think, not helpful, because environmental damage comes in degrees, right? If you're talking to someone about the environmental impact of creating a new person, even though that is a massive environmental impact, someone can just point to other things as well and say, well, you know, there are these things we can do, or there's this policy that we can encourage, or I can make these lifestyle changes. Like, there are always empirical things that people are going to point to, and it just makes the conversation very complicated. You don't get to the core root of the issue about procreation, right? So I do think it's a bit of a distraction. Like, it's a side point we can bring up with someone who's like super concerned about the environment.
Now, instead of shaming people for having kids, I focus on myself and what I can do to destroy the world a little less. Of course, no changes can happen overnight, but if we all take these baby steps, it doesn't matter how many friends we have, we won't get high cholesterol. These metaphors are getting out of control. So if we all take these baby steps, it doesn't matter how many kids we have, we just need to focus on our habits, and then we can live in a world that isn't collapsing. And you can have kids or not without being judged. I actually can take other people's friends. As in adopting, not as in robbing a child, okay?
So I think it's good here that they mention adoption, because obviously with adoption, you're not creating someone who never needed to exist, who then has to face all of the problems of reality. You're taking someone who already exists and is already probably in like a bit of a shit situation, and you're helping them out, right? And even if you take the environmental framing, obviously if you adopt someone, you're not creating a new person who is going to like cause environmental damage. And also you're taking someone who you can raise them in a way where you make them more environmentally conscious, more ethically conscious, this sort of stuff. So I do think adoption was like, it was a good thing that they included that.
I'll just make sure to teach my fry habits that are good for them and for the planet. No, a baby cannot have a baby.
So that was the video by Nas Daily and procreation and the environmental impacts of it. Let me know in the comments what you think of the video. Let me know what you think of my thoughts, if you disagree with anything. What do you think about the general topic of, you know, should we be framing the conversation about procreation in terms of the environment and all of this sort of stuff? Do you think it's helpful? And I'll see you in the next video.